You know what nobody ever asks about ancient Rome? What it was actually like to be married to a gladiator. Not the gladiator himself. We've heard plenty about him. The training, the blood, the roaring crowds, the dramatic thumbs up or down moment. Everybody loves a gladiator story. But somewhere behind the arena walls, behind the hype, behind the spectacle, there was a woman trying to hold a household together, while her husband got paid to let people try to kill him. Her name doesn't show up in the history books. Her face wasn't scratched onto the walls of Pompeii, but she existed, and her life was one of the strangest domestic arrangements the ancient world ever produced. Because being married to a gladiator in Rome meant being married to a man who was simultaneously a celebrity, a slave, a sex symbol, and legally less than human. The man you married. First, some context about the man himself. Gladiators in ancient Rome were not all captured warriors, dragged screaming from foreign battlefields. Some were, absolutely. But the gladiatorial profession also attracted free men, volunteers called octorati, who signed contracts with gladiator schools in exchange for a signing bonus, regular meals, medical care, and a shot at fame. Some were bankrupt citizens looking for a way out. Some were thrill seekers. Some were just hungry. Whatever their reason, the moment they signed that contract, they handed over their legal rights. The gladiator oath, the sacramentum gladiatorium, required them to swear to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. They became property of the ludus, the gladiator school, and their lanista, the owner-trainer who ran it. The legal term for what happened to them was infamia. It's one of those Latin words that translates perfectly, infamy. A person marked with infamia lost the right to vote, to hold public office, to testify in court, and to be protected under most Roman civil laws. Gladiators shared this status with actors, prostitutes, and convicted criminals. A wronged husband could legally kill a gladiator caught in bed with his wife, same as he could kill a slave. Your husband might be the most famous man in the city, but in the eyes of Roman law, he ranks somewhere between a stray dog and a piece of furniture. And here's the part that makes it truly bizarre. The crowd loved him anyway. Gladiators were simultaneously at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy and the absolute center of popular culture. Their names were scratched onto public walls. Their fighting records were tracked and debated. Wealthy Romans paid enormous sums to sponsor games featuring the top fighters. Children played gladiator games in the streets. A successful gladiator could earn prize money, gifts from wealthy patrons, and a level of public adoration that senators would have envied. The contradiction was hardwired into the institution. Rome needed its gladiators to be subhuman for the legal system to work, and superhuman for the entertainment system to work. Both things were true at the same time. How you got here. So how did a woman end up married to one of these men? It depended entirely on her social class. And the answer says more about Rome than it does about gladiators. Roman marriage was rarely about love. It was a financial transaction, a political alliance, or a survival strategy. Fathers arranged marriages for their daughters based on what the union could do for the family's wealth and reputation. For wealthy patrician families, that meant marrying into other wealthy patrician families. For the poor, it meant finding whoever could keep you fed. Romance was an afterthought at best, a liability at worst. Most gladiator wives fell into one of two categories. The first was the woman who was already at the bottom. If you were a freedwoman, an ex-slave, the daughter of a disgraced family, or a woman with no male relatives to arrange a proper match, your marriage options were limited. Marrying a gladiator wasn't a step down if you didn't have a step to stand on. He had steady income, a roof, and if he was good at his job, a growing reputation that could translate into favors and connections. The second category was more scandalous and far more interesting to the Roman gossip mill. These were women of higher social standing who fell for gladiators despite every social pressure telling them not to. The satirist Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, devoted a chunk of his sixth satire to the story of Eppia, the wife of a senator, who allegedly abandoned her husband, her children, and her entire social position to run off with a gladiator named Sergius. Juvenal describes Sergius with open contempt. A man past his prime, with a scar where his helmet rubbed, a wart between his nostrils, and a weeping discharge from one eye. It's the sword they're in love with, Juvenal sneered. Whether Eppia was real or a literary invention is something scholars still argue about, but the fact that Juvenal expected his audience to find the story plausible tells you everything about Rome's open secret. Respectable women wanted gladiators, and everybody knew it. Living at the ludus. If you married a gladiator, your home was the ludus, the gladiator school, and school is doing some very generous work in that sentence. The best preserved example is the gladiator barracks in Pompeii, a large rectangular complex built around a central courtyard with a colonnade of columns. Originally designed as a fancy theater lobby, it was converted into a gladiator training facility after an earthquake in 62 AD. The courtyard became the training ground. Surrounding it were 68 small rooms on the ground floor, each about 10 to 15 square meters, used as dormitories, storage, kitchens, a mess hall, stables, and an armory. Upper floors held additional quarters, presumably for the lanista, higher status gladiators, and their families. The living quarters were cramped. 2 to 3 gladiators shared each room, sleeping on straw mattresses on the floor, not beds. If you were a gladiator's wife, you shared that room, that mattress, and that lack of privacy with your husband and possibly his training partners. The walls were covered in graffiti, most of it scratched by the gladiators themselves. Over 120 inscriptions were found at Pompey's barracks, documenting victories, rivalries, boasts, and the occasional love note. Archaeologists also found a bejeweled female skeleton in one of the cells, someone's wife or lover who was visiting when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD and never made it out. She wore gold jewelry and gemstone rings, items that marked her as someone of means. What a wealthy woman was doing inside a gladiator's cell at the moment of eruption is a question that has fueled scholarly debate ever since. The most likely answer is the one Roman moralists would have hated most. She was there because she wanted to be. The gladiators were allowed to come and go from the barracks and receive guests. So the ludus wasn't exactly a prison, but it wasn't exactly freedom either. Your daily life revolved around his training schedule, his dietary requirements, the hierarchy of the school, and the whims of the lanista. You were living inside someone else's business, and your husband was the product. The medical care, oddly enough, was one of the better aspects of ludus life. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain, and dead gladiators didn't make anyone money. Every school employed doctors, sometimes quite good ones. Galen, the most famous physician in the ancient world, got his start as a doctor at a gladiator school in Pergamon around 157 AD. He treated wounds, set broken bones, and developed surgical techniques that would influence medicine for the next 1500 years. As a gladiator's wife, you had access to this medical infrastructure, at least informally. When your children were sick, the ludus physician was closer and more qualified than anything most Roman women could access. It was one of the few genuine advantages of living in a fight school, and it came at the price of watching the same doctor stitch your husband back together after every bout. The barley wife. Speaking of diet, here's a detail that probably isn't in any movie about gladiators. Your husband ate like a horse. Specifically, a horse that really liked carbohydrates. Gladiators were nicknamed hordiari, which translates to barley men, because their diet consisted overwhelmingly of barley, beans, and other grains. Analysis of gladiator bones from a cemetery excavated at Ephesus in modern Turkey, dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, confirmed this. The gladiators' bone chemistry showed a diet dramatically higher in plant-based foods than the general population. This wasn't because the lanista was a health food enthusiast. The logic was brutally practical. Gladiators needed a thick layer of subcutaneous fat. Fat absorbs shallow cuts and slashes without damaging the muscle underneath, which means a gladiator could bleed spectacularly for the crowd without actually losing combat effectiveness. A lean gladiator is a dead gladiator. So your husband ate mountains of barley, porridge, and bean stew, washed down with a tonic that Pliny the Elder found revolting, a drink made from bone ash or charred wood dissolved in water. The Ephesus bones confirm this too, showing elevated calcium and strontium levels consistent with regular ash consumption. He drank it because it strengthened his bones. You served it because that was your life now. As his wife, you were likely responsible for much of the food preparation, at least within your own quarters. The school had communal kitchens, but a married gladiator with a family unit had some degree of domestic autonomy. You cooked his meals according to the school's dietary guidelines, which were set by the ludus physician whose job was to keep the gladiators in fighting shape. Your husband's body wasn't his own. It was an investment, and you helped maintain it. The result of this diet was that gladiators didn't look anything like the chiseled fighters in the movies. They were heavy, padded, more sumo wrestler than Marvel superhero. Roman sculptures and mosaics depicting gladiators consistently show thick, heavy-set men with substantial bellies. This wasn't neglect. It was engineering. Every pound of subcutaneous fat was armor against the blades. When your husband came home from training, he didn't look like a Greek statue. He looked like a man who had eaten his body weight in porridge, because he had, and the ash drink gave him a faintly metallic smell that probably never fully washed off. Romance in the ludus was, by all available evidence, a practical affair. The fan club problem. And then there were the fans. If your husband was any good, he had groupies. This wasn't a subtle phenomenon. The walls of Pompeii are scratched with graffiti that reads like ancient fan mail. Salatus the Thracian makes the girls sigh. Salatus the heartthrob of the girls. These weren't written by the gladiators themselves. They were written by women, teenage girls, and admirers who worshiped these fighters the way modern fans worship athletes or rock stars. The sexual appeal of gladiators was an open and well-documented fact of Roman life. Roman writers treated it as self-evident that women were attracted to gladiators and used this attraction as a weapon against women's morality. Juvenal's story about Epia was one example. Another was the rumor surrounding Faustina the Younger, wife of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reportedly became so obsessed with a gladiator she saw during a parade that she fell physically ill. According to the Historia Augusta, a notoriously unreliable collection of imperial biographies, Marcus consulted astrologers about his wife's condition. Their advice was to have the gladiator killed and have Faustina bathe in his blood, then lie with her husband. The Historia Augusta claims this was actually done, and that Commodus, the couple's son who grew up to be one of Rome's most erratic emperors, was really the gladiator's child. Historians doubt every word of this, but the fact that it was recorded at all tells you how deeply the gladiator as sexual threat narrative ran through Roman culture. As a gladiator's wife, you lived inside this mythology. Your husband was the object of public sexual fantasy, and you had no mechanism to control it. Women showed up at the ludus. They sent messages. They paid for private meetings. Whether any given gladiator actually slept with his fans is unknowable, but the temptation was structured into the job. Celebrity, physical prowess, the constant proximity of death. Rome treated its gladiators the way it treated its chariot racers, as bodies to desire and discard. You just happened to be married to one of those bodies. What the law thought of you. Roman law did not make life easy for gladiator wives. Because your husband carried infamia, his legal protections were minimal, and yours weren't much better by association. If your husband was a slave gladiator, your marriage wasn't even technically a marriage. Roman law only recognized marriage, called iustum matrimonium, between citizens. Slaves couldn't marry. What they had instead was contubernium, a recognized cohabitation that carried no legal weight whatsoever. You were together, you might have children, but the law saw you as two pieces of property that happened to be in the same room. If your husband was a free volunteer, the situation was marginally better but still grim. He'd signed away most of his rights. You were married to a man who could be legally killed, beaten, or burned by his owner, without consequence. If another man killed your husband during training or in the arena, you had no legal claim for damages. If the lanista decided to sell your husband to another school, he was gone, and you had no say. Inheritance was another minefield. The children of gladiators inherited their father's infamia. Your sons couldn't hold public office. Your daughter's marriage prospects were damaged. The stain followed the family, not just the individual. Roman jurists debated the exact boundaries of gladiatorial infamia for centuries, which tells you it was complicated enough that even the lawyers couldn't agree. Some scholars argue that volunteer gladiators retained more rights than enslaved ones, but the practical reality was that your entire family existed in a legal gray zone where protection depended on the goodwill of your husband's owner, not the authority of the state. The Collegia and what happened when he died. Gladiators died. That was the business. The mortality rate in the arena has been estimated at somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 per bout, depending on the period and the type of match. If your husband fought regularly, the odds caught up eventually. And when they did, Roman society had built a system, barely adequate but real, to handle what came next. Gladiators could join Collegia, burial societies that functioned as a crude form of mutual aid. Members paid a joining fee of 100 sesterces and monthly dues of about 1.25 sesterces, along with a contribution of an amphora of wine. In exchange, the collegium guaranteed a proper burial for fallen members and, crucially, financial compensation for their wives and children. The collegium also provided a social network. It held 6 feasts a year, creating a community among gladiators and their families that cut across the rigid hierarchies of the ludus. The burial itself mattered enormously. In Roman culture, an improper burial was worse than a bad death. It condemned the soul to wander, unanchored, between worlds. Gladiators who died in the arena were normally dragged out through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of death, and their bodies were handled by specialized funeral workers. Without a collegium, a gladiator might end up in a mass grave with criminals and the destitute. With one, he got a proper headstone, a funeral ceremony, and a memorial that acknowledged he had been a person. Some of these tombstones survive. One reads, "To the departed spirit of Marcus Antonius Niger, veteran gladiator of the Thracian style. He lived 38 years and fought 18 times." Another was erected by a woman named Flavia Diogenes for her well-deserving husband. These stones are the closest we get to hearing the voices of gladiator wives, brief, formal, and achingly human. The grief that nobody pitied. When your gladiator died, the grief was real, but the sympathy wasn't. Roman elite society viewed gladiator wives with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. You had married below the threshold of respectability. You had chosen infamia. Whatever happened to you was, in their eyes, the natural consequence of a bad decision. Satirists mocked you. Moralists used you as a cautionary tale. The law mostly ignored you. If your husband had been a slave, his death might not even be officially recorded beyond the Lanista's accounting books. Your children were still legally enslaved, property of the ludus owner, unless specific arrangements had been made. If your husband was a volunteer, you might inherit whatever he'd managed to save, but gladiator pay was irregular and the lanista took a significant cut. The collegium payment, if your husband had been a member, was enough to cover the funeral and maybe a few months of expenses. After that, you were on your own. Some gladiator widows remarried within the profession. The ludus was a closed world, and the women within it often knew each other, shared meals, watched each other's children, and formed bonds forged by the shared experience of loving men who fought for a living. When one husband fell, marrying another gladiator wasn't just practical, it was staying within the only community that understood what your life was. Others left the world of the arena entirely and tried to reintegrate into ordinary Roman society, which was easier said than done when your name was associated with infamia. A few, presumably the ones married to the biggest stars, lived comfortably on savings and public generosity. The wife of a champion Murmillo or Secutor, who had won dozens of bouts, might have enough saved to buy a small shop or rent an apartment in a decent neighborhood. But for most, widowhood meant a return to the same poverty that had led them to the gladiator barracks in the first place. The children of the arena. If you had children with your gladiator husband, their lives were shaped by the arena before they could walk. Sons of gladiators frequently followed their fathers into the profession. It wasn't always a choice. Children of slave gladiators were born as property of the ludus, and the lanista could train them as fighters the moment they were old enough. Even sons of free gladiators were drawn to the profession by familiarity and limited alternatives. When your father's trade carries infamia, the respectable guilds and professions aren't exactly lining up to take you. Daughters had it differently, but not necessarily better. Marriage prospects were constrained by their father's status. A freedman or low-status citizen might marry a gladiator's daughter without social cost, but anyone higher up the social ladder would think twice. The stigma was real, and it was persistent. Tombstone inscriptions suggest that some gladiator families managed to climb out of infamia within a generation or two, but the process was slow and required the family to completely distance itself from the arena. The children grew up in the ludus environment, surrounded by violence, discipline, and an unsettling normality about death. They played in the same courtyard where their fathers trained to fight. They heard the sounds of wooden practice, swords against wooden shields from dawn. They ate the same barley and bean diet. And they understood, from an age when most children are still figuring out how the world works, that their father left the house periodically to participate in an event where dying was part of the job description. There's an aspect of ludus childhood that historians have only recently started examining: the emotional and psychological world of these kids. Gladiator children lived in a place where men regularly came home injured, sometimes seriously. They grew up around blood, bandages, and the ludus physician's tools. They watched their mothers care for fathers who had been slashed, bruised, or concussed in training. And on game days, they either went to the arena and watched their father fight, which was its own kind of trauma, or they stayed home and waited, which might have been worse. The uncertainty of it, the crowd noise from miles away, the moment when your father either walked back through the gate or didn't. We have no surviving accounts written by gladiator children, but the tombstones tell us they existed, and the silence around their inner lives is one of the loudest absences in Roman social history. Why she stayed? The obvious question, at least to a modern audience, is why a woman would stay in this arrangement. And the honest answer is that the question misunderstands what options look like for women at the bottom of Roman society. For a freed woman or a woman from a poor family, the alternative to marrying a gladiator wasn't marrying a senator, it was marrying nobody. It was working in a textile shop for starvation wages. It was begging. It was prostitution. In a society that offered women almost no economic independence, a gladiator husband provided income, housing, food, medical care by proximity to the ludus physician, and a social community through the Collegium. He also provided something harder to measure but no less real: status within a subculture that, however despised by polite society, had its own hierarchy and its own pride. And there were the exceptional cases. The gladiators who won their freedom earned the rudis, the wooden sword, symbolizing release from service, and retired as free men with savings and fame. The rudis ceremony was one of the great moments in Roman entertainment. The crowd roared, the editor of the games presented the wooden sword, and a man who had entered the arena as property walked out as a free citizen. A retired champion gladiator could open his own school, work as a trainer, or live off the gifts of wealthy admirers. His wife went from the cramped quarters of the ludus to something approaching a middle-class Roman life. Some retired gladiators became incredibly wealthy. Tombstone evidence from across the empire shows freed gladiators who owned property, employed servants, and left substantial inheritances to their families. For the wife who had endured years of barley, porridge, and sleepless nights before game days, that retirement must have felt like emerging from underwater. It happened. Not often, but enough to keep the possibility alive. The truth about gladiator wives is that they occupied a space Roman society had no category for. They weren't respectable matrons, they weren't prostitutes, they weren't slaves, usually. They were women who had attached their lives to men who existed in a legal and social no man's land, somewhere between hero and property, celebrity and criminal. They cooked barley porridge, raised children in a fight school, endured their husbands' celebrity affairs, navigated a legal system that barely acknowledged their existence, and buried men whose tombstones they paid for themselves. None of it was glamorous. Most of it was barely survivable. And yet the walls of Pompeii, the bones from Ephesus, the tombstones erected by wives whose names we'll never fully know, all of it says the same thing. They were there, they just weren't the ones anybody thought to write about.